I turn you now to Matt Hill, who actually lives and works in the Washington, D.C. area. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. If I look a little red, it's not because I'm embarrassed. It's because I achieved what I thought was never possible, a sunburn on the Oregon coast from the field trip yesterday, so it was a beautiful day. Mark covered a lot of numbers that are very important, especially funding for BIA forestry, which translates to work on the ground here, and that translates into jobs for the tribes and for services. My portion of the presentation, I really only have three numbers, and they're 218, 60, and 1. And I'll end with those. And a couple of people probably know what those are already. So I'm going to focus on the legislative side of the equation. I'm creating new ITC history by beaming from wireless internet, wireless transmission.
If we want to be serious about improving upon the status quo, we need to require proactive planning that includes minimum standards to guarantee.
That is a live audio feed from the House Natural Resources Committee, which in Washington, D.C. right now is debating amendments and ultimately final passage of legislation that Mark mentioned, the Resilient Federal Forest Act of 2015, which includes authorization for the Forest Service and BLM to manage lands differently, but also includes tribal provisions, which I'll touch on in a second. Excuse me. Tuesday evening, Chief Don Ivey of the Coqual, in his address here in this room, mentioned the word of the week being antecedent, and I think that's an important thing to talk about when you look at legislation. Back in 2002, here in southwestern Oregon, the Biscuit Fire was burning, and ultimately more fires in Southern California were burning, and forced Congress to really take a hard look at the management of federal forests for forest health and wildfire. And 2 years later, in 2004, they passed the Healthy Forest Restoration Act. At that time, ITC worked with Congress. I was working there at the time, and that bill included the Tribal Forest Protection Act, which gives tribes the ability to petition federal agencies to engage in forest health management activities to reduce the risk of wildfire coming across onto tribal land. Both of those bills were intended to change the course of fire behavior on forest land. 10, 12 years later, not a whole lot has changed, particularly on the Tribal Forest Protection Act. It's been 10 years. Only a handful of projects have been fully implemented. ITC and the Forest Service have reviewed that. But beyond that, counties like the one we're in here in Coos County, across the rural West, are still not having a strong economy where they have federal timber. There's the threat of them losing county payments as a share of federal revenues. So the problems are still existing, and Congress is going back to take another crack at charting a different course for the management of federal lands and for the health of federal lands. The bill that they're currently debating, the Resilient Federal Forest Act of 2015, was introduced pretty much last week. The ITC had been in discussions with the committee for quite some time, but that only happened after years of President Phil Rigdon coming out to D.C. testifying on forest management, on wildfire, on IFMAT, on appropriations, and building the relationships and trust level with staff. And then those staff quit and get other jobs, and then you have to start over with new staff. So it's been a multi-year process, but we did work with the committee, and there are two provisions I want to hit on that are in this bill that they're debating right now. The first is on the Tribal Forest Protection Act, and what the committee did is they included a provision that does three things. One, if a tribe petitions the Forest Service or Interior to do a TFPA project, it can't just, the petition can't just sit there. The Secretary has to provide an initial response within 120 days, and the intent is to ensure that they take it seriously and take a hard look at what the tribe is asking them to do. Second, if they're going to not do the project or deny the request from the tribe, they have to tell the tribe within 1 year. They can't be waiting out there for multiple years wondering whether or not the agency is even going to act. And third, all environmental documentation and review and assignment of the actual contract has to be issued within 2 years of the initial tribal petition. So in theory, if this were enacted into law, a TFPA project, the implementation phase would actually begin mandatorily within 2 years of the tribe's request. And that certainly would be an improvement from where we are now. The intent is to give the Forest Service some parameters in which to respond, and also to give tribes some certainty that their requests will be reviewed and implemented in a good time frame. The second provision that's in this House bill, I call tribal homeland restoration. And it's kind of an open-ended provision, but what it says is that if a tribe goes to either the Forest Service or the Department of Interior, it can petition to restore lands on non-tribal federal lands, but it doesn't, unlike TFPA, it doesn't have to be adjacent to tribal reservation land. It can be anywhere within those federal lands where the tribe has kind of a singular linkage to it, whether or not it be ceded land in a treaty or Aboriginal homelands or other connection. But the big difference between this and TFPA is that in this authority, that project, that land would be managed it would be considered Indian land for the purpose of management, which means that the tribe, working with BIA, working with whatever the land management agency, that whole process for putting together the project, doing the environmental review, would be done under NFIRMA. And in fact, the way it's worded in the bill, it's actually an amendment to the National Indian Forest Resources Management Act. So this is a very novel concept. Nothing like this has really been considered before. When I'm done speaking, I'm probably going to plug back into the markup to see if they're debating it. But it's very exciting for us to have Congress talking about this, and they're talking about it because for several years they've been saying what we already know, which is that tribes have a unique and great approach to land management. And there are lessons to be learned, and those lessons can be applied beyond tribal land, and it can be a win-win for everybody. So that's what we're up to out in Washington, D.C. right now. I'll conclude by going back to my three numbers, 2, 18, 60, and 1. Those are not my winning bingo numbers from last night. It refers to the threshold to pass a law in the United States. You have to get a simple majority in the House, which is 218 votes. For something mildly controversial like forest management, you're going to need 60 votes in the Senate, and you're going to need one person in the White House to sign it. And so we're at the very beginning of this process on reviewing this forest legislation, but it's going to take a lot of twists and turns because you have to get through those three numbers. But that's what we're working on. ITC has great relationships on both sides of the aisle and friends on both sides of the aisle, so I'm looking forward to it. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.